Welcome back. We would like to welcome you to the second lecture of our seminar today with Dr. Noel Johnson, who is the Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University. He is also a research fellow at the Mercatus Center and a faculty member at the Center for the Study of Public Choice. His recent research is focused on the historical origins of modern liberal institutions, and he recently published with Mark Koyama the book Persecution and Toleration, The Long Road to Religious Freedom. The title of his lecture today is Douglass North and the Hard Problem of Institutional Change. Dr. Johnson?
Okay, thank you, Jason, and thanks everybody for attending at 4:45 on a Saturday evening. And I'm going to pull up some slides and give you my lecture. So just 1 second here. Okay, so what I'd like to talk to you about this evening is Doug North and the hard problem of institutional change. I studied with Doug when I was doing my PhD at Washington University in St. Louis. And let me start this by telling you a little bit of a story. What I want you to get from this is partly about something about the evolution of how Doug North thought about institutions and where that's led us today. But more generally, this is a story about the different ways we can think about institutions and institutional change and how it's related to the development of liberal society, which I'll get to towards the end. So the story, to start us off. Like all good economic historians, Douglass North started out as a Marxist. This changed one day in June 1941 when he showed up to protest potential American involvement in World War II. He showed up to the march, but this being June 1941, no one else was there. And of course, what happened was that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was just been violated, and the Germans had invaded the Soviet Union. And so all the Marxists have now turned to being more belligerent. So Doug stopped being a Marxist, and he joined the Merchant Marine because he was a pacifist during the war. And when he joined the Merchant Marine, eventually he got out, and he was a professor at the University of Washington. And the first stage of his thought in thinking about institutions, it came in thinking about ocean shipping. So Doug, being in the Merchant Marine, he also enjoyed going to museums, looking at models of ships. And in the Netherlands, I think it was Denmark or the Netherlands, according to the story he tells, he was looking at these models and he was noticing the evolution of them over time, and that the models of these ships from, say, the 18th century and the 19th century had less and less cannon and armaments, on them. And this led to a paper, which I'm going to describe to you, which is what I call Douglass North version 1 on institutions, and it's from around 1968. And it's from the Journal of Political Economy, and this paper is called Sources of Productivity Change in Ocean Shipping, 1600 to 1850. And just to make it clear, the institution that Doug is going to be talking about here is about security of property rights. And what the paper is about is basically that piracy was stopped on the high seas by national navies, and this allowed superior ship designs to be adopted because property rights are being enforced better. So why is that necessarily about institutions? Let me explain more. So there were massive gains in ocean shipping productivity in the early 19th century. That's one of the things that Doug noticed. And and so when you think about how you can have an improvement in output for something, you either have more stuff or you're going to use that stuff better. So if you use the stuff better, that's productivity increasing. Productivity improvements we often think of as being due to technological change. And that's actually what Doug North thought for as well for a little while. But by the time he wrote this paper, he had realized that the major technological innovation that was leading to these productivity gains actually had originated well before 1815 in the late 1500s. And so this was the Dutch flute. That's how you pronounce, apparently, F-L-U-I-T in Dutch. And the Dutch flute was a ship that had no cannon on it, okay? It was pear-shaped in the cross-section, partly because they wanted the deck to be as small as possible because the Danes were taxing ship traffic based on the size of the deck. And it had a lot of block and tackle built into it to help move cargo around. So the Dutch flute, though, like I just said, was not armed. And it was not generally adopted for a large number of these ocean shipping routes until the early 19th century, these innovations, that were incorporated in the Dutch flout. And the reason why they were eventually was because the Mediterranean, for example, and other parts of the high seas were made safe from pirates by national navies. This is a picture of the USS Enterprise capturing the Tripoli. So from, I think they called it Tripoliana, which was, the Barbary pirates, okay? And this is in 1815. And so this is actually a really big paper because the argument is that it wasn't the technological change per se. The technological change didn't matter until you actually started enforcing property rights. And in 1968, that was a revolutionary type of thing to say in the article. So today, that version of what Marx did, of what Douglas North did, is largely accepted. Most economists, political scientists largely agree that institutions matter. This is like the go-to picture, right? To demonstrate this because it's so beautiful. This is lights at night, and we're looking at the Korean Peninsula. And of course, one of the main things here is that South Korea has done really well with their institutions. North Korea, not so much, with the exception of Pyongyang, because you have to have some lights on so the great leader Kim Jong-un can read books at night. And so this is a dramatic representation of differences in institutions and how that translates into economic performance. That was the beginning, okay? But now we can go to Douglas North version 2, which is from around 1973, when he published this book with Robert Paul Thomas, The Rise of the Western World, a New Economic History, which I still highly recommend. It's a relatively short book. It's probably one of the main books that got me into economic history. It's no longer cutting edge, but it's extremely well written, and there's a lot to learn from it, like many books. So here, what Doug is arguing is that institutional change now, we're talking about change, which is much more complicated than just saying institutions matter. But institutional change can be explained by rational agents responding to relative price movements. So this is very much a world of neoclassical economics that North is still working in. So one of the best lines from the book, right, here's a quote that I'll actually read to you. They wrote in on the third page that if all that is required for economic growth is investment and innovation, why have some societies missed this desirable outcome? The answer, we contend, the factors we have listed, innovation, economies of scale, education, capital accumulation, and so forth, are not the causes of growth, they are growth. So I teach economic growth and development, and we spend about 80% of the time talking about things like education, capital accumulation, the Solow model, the economies of scale, technological change. But this is an absolutely right statement by North and Thomas that those things are all well and good, but the question is, how do you get them, right? And so those things are not the causes of growth, they are growth. And what he's looking at in this book is, how can we explain the causes of growth? And one of the #1 examples that he provides is he talks about the Black Death as being something that generates institutional change and changes in performance. And so you have to think about the world as there's this whole world of institutions that exist, and these institutions form constraints and guidelines for how people can contract within them. And then, and that's how the world normally works. And relative prices matter there, right? But they only matter within the context of the institutions you have. But every now and then something big happens, like between 1347 and 1352, 40% of the population of Europe dies. And this generates a big change in relative prices. You have a lot less labor. So the relative price of labor to land, which is the relevant one here, becomes very high. Laborers have more bargaining power, and you have things like feudal institutions being abandoned. For example, serfs are released from their land and these sorts of things. And this is the story that they told. I'm going to give you another story, which is specific to this, that's based on some of my own research, not published yet, but working on it. So what we're looking at here to illustrate this concept that North and Thomas were working on is city-level Black Death mortality rates. So again, between 1347 and 1352, this bacterial pandemic, this infection, came in. It originated from Black Sea port of Kaffa, came in, hit Messina in Sicily first, and then it spread through trade throughout Europe over the next few years. And for the sizes of the circles, you can see there's a lot of variation in what mortality was at the city level from this. And so you would imagine that different regions are also going to be having their relative prices changed by different amounts. If you lose no labor, then the relative price of labor to land is not changing as much as if you lose 80% of your population. And if you then think about what this is going to do to bargaining power and what it's going to do to institutional change, think of something like a guild. So guilds are basically, they have monopsony power over labor, and they also have some monopoly power, but let's focus on monopsony. They basically restrict the labor market because they want to be able to train people and they want those people to get extra profit, right? You know, that they do train. If you're in the guild, you're kind of made, right? You know, and you're the only person who's allowed to sell cloth, you know, or barrels or whatever it is that the guild is responsible for in your town. So what happens when you half the population, right, in that town? Well, you're making it much more difficult for them to control the labor market because you need to still attract people to come to your town, right? And as labor becomes more scarce, it becomes more difficult to do. If we look, there's a database of 12,000 observations on guilds over this time. And if we look at the Black Death mortality rate down here, and if you look at whether or not the probability that you observe a guild being mentioned in a city after 1400, so that's 50 years after the Black Death ends, basically the higher the mortality rate, the more the labor power, the less likely you are to have a guild showing up. Lower mortality rates, more likely to have a guild showing up. This is exactly the sort of institutional change that North and Thomas were talking about, potentially. But again, I want to emphasize, it's not the guilds per se, you're actually changing the laws, right? You're changing the laws, regulation, and norms that existed because of this change in relative prices. So if we look at Eli Heckscher, who wrote this great book, a great two-volume book called Mercantilism in the first part of the 20th century, you know, he writes right here, the Great Pestilence, that's the Black Death, had led to a rise in prices, and particularly in wages, like I was just talking about. And an actor, the king, took this as a motive to making local bodies in Paris, above all guilds, dependent on royal institutions. The decrees that he issued down here to make it easier for strangers to practice their craft within the town stipulated that any person who was able to practice the craft or introduce a commodity might do so, and so long as his craft was a good and honorable one. So institutions, the laws are changed as a result of the relative price movement. That's the institutional change that's taking place. That's how he's explaining it, Doug North, by 1973, which is actually, I'm doing it now. We all do, this is still farther than most people go. A lot of people in the field are still just talking about institutions matter, all right? Institutional change is hard. Okay, well, let's push this a little bit further. So one thing that's hard to deal with is that institutions, think of them at this point now as rules of the game. So formal and informal rules that structure exchange. Formal rules, things like constitutions, informal things, not as much quite yet with this version of Doug North, but eventually we're going to be there on the next slide. You know, but they're going to be, you know, things like trust, right, and that sort of thing. We'll talk more about it. But institutions persist, right? We don't change our rules regarding like property law often. And there's a good reason for this, because if we did, there'd be a high amount of uncertainty and trade would be very hard. Nonetheless, if you want to explain institutional change, you need to start thinking about why this happens sometimes and why it doesn't others. And in general, it doesn't happen enough, which is why there's such persistent poverty, right, you know, that exists in the world. At this point in Douglas North's thinking, he focused on transaction costs to explain why institutions change sometimes, but not. And these are things like search and information costs, bargaining costs, and enforcement costs for getting things done. But we're still in the world of neoclassical economic theory. So that's going to change. And it changes by around 1981 for Douglas North, for what in the book that many people consider to be his best book. He had a bunch, Structure and Change in Economic History. So here, North is claiming that institutional change can't be explained by the standard neoclassical tools. That is, prices plus the standard neoclassical behavioral assumptions. Instead, we need to consider beliefs, culture, ideology, religion, things like this, okay? This is a big step for an economist. We love our prices, right? And we don't love shadow prices. We like prices that we can observe. This is why we make students take a class called price theory and don't let them graduate unless they pass it, because you need to know how markets and prices operate, right? And what's going on here with Douglas North version 3 is North is moving away. But he definitely cares still about prices, like in markets and things like this, but he's starting to talk about things that scare economists off, like ideology, right? And norms, right? And so this is kind of a big move. And it's going to be pushing the analysis of institutions in a different direction. So let's look at an example from the French Revolution. I'd like to think about why these norms and beliefs may have mattered and why North went this path. So some background on the French Revolution. First of all, for those of you who have forgotten, it was in 1789, right? That's when it's kicking off, July 14th. This is a painting by Eugene Delacroix, who did this in, I think he did in 1830 or so. But it's going to illustrate something that I want you to understand about the French Revolution, and that is that it was a very nationalistic movement. It was involved with, they wanted to change the calendar, they wanted to, liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, and brotherhood, or death. Basically, is the part that comes at the end of that. They wanted everybody to be together in a unified whole. This painting it kind of symbolizes this. You can see liberty, right? With the French flag. She's wearing a Phrygian cap, which is based off of the kind of cap that Romans, freed Roman slaves when they were given their liberty, would wear. You can see all the eyes in action. They kind of focus, onto her. It's all the lines converge onto her. And then you can see who are the kind of people in this painting. There's a guy from the bourgeoisie, right? So the middle class, upper middle class worker. He has a hunting rifle. There's a worker, a working class person here. He has a cape, or not a cape, whatever that's called. A working. I'm not going to get caught up trying to remember that. But he's a worker, right? And then you also have so you have all classes represented: working class, bourgeoisie. You have women and men. You have all ages. You have children in the picture. The revolution was for everybody, and everybody had to be on the same page and following along. Notre Dame, the #1 mark of Frenchness, at the early 19th century, there's no Eiffel Tower, right? This is also in the background, right? So it's this major nationalistic movement. And just to give you a sense, next point. But in many ways, as the French Revolution was approaching, France was quite fractionalized. It was not a unified whole. Many of you know a lot about France, but let me just remind you, if you think about ethno-linguistic fractionalization, so just what languages were being spoken, like around France in, say, 1600 or 1750. You had this region right here, Brittany, where people were speaking Breton. People were speaking Flemish up here. They were speaking more or less German-ish right in here. Down here, they were speaking something called langue. My pencil switched. There we go. They were speaking something called Languedoc, named after how you say yes. Do you say doch, or do you say oi? This is the Languedoc. Like right here, you have some Basques, down here. But these are different languages, right? All within the same country. And what the revolution needed was they needed everybody to be on the same page in many ways. Like, for example, many of you have heard of the calling of the Estates General, which was the precursor event to the French Revolution. There you had 3 estates. The first estate were the clergy, the second estate were the nobility, the third estate was everybody else, basically urban bourgeoisie, right? And of these estates, the third estate had like double the delegates of all the other ones. And then the second estate and the first estate were there as well. And so a big issue when the Estates General was called was traditionally they would vote by estates, even though the number of delegates who came was much higher for the third estate. And so this, of course, made it easy for the clergy and the nobility to always outvote everybody else, the non-elites. But they debated at the Estates General, should we allow voting by head or do we do voting by estate? And in order to come to agreement on these sorts of things, you have to have a certain sense of common outlook, right, on things. And so in order to have a revolution, in order to develop a constitution, in order to build a state, which is what they were doing, you need to get people on the same page. Basically, this is a big instance of institutional change. So Alexis de Tocqueville, he had some ideas on this, and he wrote a book called The Old Regime and the French Revolution. And much of book 2 in that book was about how the revolution came about. And what he says, and what he emphasizes throughout, is this: it is only government by a single man that in the long run irons out diversities and makes each member of a nation indifferent to his neighbor's law. So what Tocqueville is saying here is that the absolute monarchy was actually leveling people's preferences and unifying people well before the revolution took place. They were turning, I won't say peasants into Frenchmen because that's somebody else's title, but they were forcing the monarchs that came before the revolution, like Louis XIV, 15, and 16, by the actions they were engaged in, they were forcing people to look not at the local, but more at the French, the more national level things. One can test this, and I attempt to do it in a paper that's out there. This is from that, using data that comes from the Cahiers de Doléances. So basically, when the Estates General is called, before, like right when the revolution was about to start off, you have the first, the second, and the third estates. They were asked to write up their grievances. And these were coming from all these localities that are the dots here. Every single one of those dots, we have information from the Cahiers for all three estates. And they're saying things like, the third estate might complain about being taxed for using a flour mill to grind their wheat with the local nobility. Or they might be arguing that we want unified weights and measures. Or they might be arguing about whether we think feudalism should be abolished. We don't like all these feudal rules, okay? What else is going on? So the shading in this picture is basically that these Cahiers have been coded. And so they go from, are you talking about things that are about national identity or about local identity, right? Local identity would be, I'm really upset with my local landlord, right? National identity would be, I want a unified school system, right? Or something like this. And darker means you're talking about more national level things. Lighter is you're talking about more local things. The red boundary here, the border rather, that I have here, this marks a region called it's in French called the Cyclos farms. It's the 5 big farms. These are tax farms. This is an area where I can demonstrably show, and it's been written about a lot, that the monarchy was much stronger. So this is all before the revolution, okay? These tax farms are unified in the middle of the 17th century, okay? Or rather, close to that. So taxation is much higher here. And also there's much fewer rights for local lords. So feudal institutions have already been suppressed in favor of the national monarchical institutions, okay, in those regions. And what you can see by looking at this picture, I don't have to show you anything crazily detailed. This is basically like the North Korea argument. You can see if you go right to the border, there's a discontinuity, right? Where you have places that are just outside of where the monarchy is strong have much less affiliation with national identity than places that are just inside that border, okay? Which is support, I think, for what Tocqueville was talking about. Now, what sorts of things are there? This is a way too complicated slide. The only reason it's here is for me to point out The people inside that Saint-Gros ferme, the darker area, they're more likely to ask for, they want national education, uniformity of the administrative and legal system, greater economic uniformity. They want to approve vote by head in these states general, which is going to be the thing that lets the third state win, right? And they do. The same law for all of the first, second, and third estates. Those were different at the time. Did they want to suppress or maintain guilds? And should they abolish feudal dues? They want more likely to abolish the feudal dues. They were talking about these issues more in that dark shaded region. And within that dark shaded region, the nobility and the third estates were more likely to be in agreement on all these things as well, and on the same page, which is what you need to get your institutional change to occur. So I'm not done yet with this picture, but already we can see one thing that matters to get institutional change to occur is that you need to have the ideas matter. Do people think of themselves as local people, or are they French people, right? In order to get agreement, that mattered. But it's actually much more complicated than that, and it's more complicated than the story I've led you on to believe. If you look at these regions right here, the ones that are not under the purview of the monarchy within the 5 big farms, that's really close to these language groups that we were talking about before. And so there is a deep thing in here that even to get to the point where the state capacity, the monarchy, can start molding people in this Tocquevillian way, there is still this issue that they were mainly able to do it for people who speak the same language, right? It's the underlying norms and culture, you know, that seem to be driving a lot of it. And this is the kind of thing that I think North was trying to get at in version 3. And it also suggests how hard our problem is going to be in figuring out how institutional change occurs. You can't, well, you can try to force everybody to speak the same language, but that's a recipe for disaster, and it's not usually what we want to recommend. Policy is now becoming more complicated. The analysis is becoming much more complicated. And we're not done yet. This is the last version of Douglas North I'm going to talk to you about, and I'm skipping 1 or 2 of them. But this is Douglas North version 4 from around 2009. And this is when he published his book with John Wallace and Barry Weingast on violence and social orders. And you can't quite read the subtitle here, but I like the subtitle. It's a conceptual framework for interpreting recorded human history. Doug was not afraid to go for the big fish. Okay, so here in this book, the argument that is being made is that in order to understand institutional change, we must understand how organizations interact with institutions to explain it. So organizations now are being explicitly, or what are organizations? These are the actors. The famous metaphor that North gave was the sports analogy, you know, that the institutions are the, you know, the rules of how you play the game, right? And also the norms of whether you break those rules and so forth. And the players are the organizations, okay? But, you know, more specifically, you can think of these organizations as being things like political groups, right? Political parties, firms, lobbying groups. They're still individuals, right? But they're often going to be, you know, things like religious groups, things like this, distinct from the institutions. But the argument here now is that we must model both those organizations and the institutions together in order to understand what's going on. And the concept of the limited access order in the natural state, so the focus on limited access order, is being brought into this conversation. So what is the limited access order? I'll tell you, it'll be a little bit complicated, and then I'll give you some examples. So the argument is that violence, which is a big problem, it's in the title of the book, right? You want to control violence. And it's going to be contained when political entities, we'll call them politicians, create barriers to entry, which create rents, which can be used to purchase peace, basically trade it off to make peace. So some of you might not, actually even the economist here might not fully grasp, but what is a rent? It is a payment to a factor of production above cost that's generated by limiting entry in this case. So for example, if I'm a politician and I create a monopoly in the market for gunpowder, or a monopoly, as we'll talk about in just a second, in the market for cigarettes or for oil, right? then monopolists make sweet, sweet monopoly profit, right? You know, when my students, my undergraduate students ask me, because they're taking my economic history class and they mistakenly think I know something about making money, but they say, we're doing economics, how do I make money? The answer is actually really easy. You might get yourself a monopoly. That's how you make money. So, you know, but if you have a politician, you need to set the rules, make the regulations that create a monopoly or a quota or like a grain board in a developing country. That's then going to generate these profits, these rents. And you, as the politician, can control who gets to own that monopoly. And it might be, say, military people who will then not kill you because they have monopoly that's paying them a lot of money. And then that's the trade. But you notice here, stability of society, the political stability is now being maintained through what's being done in the economic sphere. If we don't have those monopolies, then the politics will be undermined and violence will ensue. You think now about going to a developing country and you tell them, for example, we want you to get rid of your grain board, or we want you to get rid of your monopoly in the production of cigarettes. Well, you know, there might be resistance to that because if it's done, the government loses its control of those rents. They can't give it to anybody. And the ruler might know that they might die, right? Because there's no longer that trade taking place. That's the limited access border idea. All right. So here's some examples. Present day Russia. Russian oil and gas is largely monopolized. Companies like Rosneft, Gazprom, and Transneft, which owns the pipelines, are all state-owned and largely monopolies. There's some other companies out there, but there's a lot of monopoly power. And so you think about Putin, right? And you know, you think about does this fact, you know, that the state has these monopolies give us some insight into Russian behavior. So for example, a few years ago, world energy prices, which the Russians don't control, nobody controls that, started to decline, well, except perhaps the Saudis a little bit, but it's hard. They started to decline a few years ago. And this means that the rents that were coming from Rosneft, Gazprom, Transneft, they were going down, right? Because the price of what those monopolies sold was going down. At the same time, you saw a shift in the behavior in Russia by people like Putin towards demonizing the USA, talking in jingoistic terms about Russian nationalism. And also they invaded Ukraine, which was a very, you know, one of the best ways to build your power and to support your political power is to start a military intervention, right? You know, because people often get behind that kind of thing. So that was, I'm not a Russian expert, you have to ask Branko Milanovic, but you know, this is a highly tied, you know, to what's going on in the limited access order that's set up in Russia. What do you think would happen to Putin's power if these companies were fully privatized? So when the West complains, right, you know, that this is a bad situation, it's actually perfectly rational, this institutional equilibrium from the point of view of the economics and the politics in Russia. I'll give you one more modern example, then I'll tell you one more story about history. In China, there's a Chinese tobacco monopoly. So there's a state tobacco monopoly administration and the China National Tobacco Corporation, who are all run by the Ministry of Information Industry and Information Technology in China. So these people both produce as monopolists and also regulate, right? Good deal. So this is a particularly good deal because China accounts for about 40% of the world's total consumption of cigarettes. So you think about, that's how you have the limited access border set up, one aspect of it in China. You have these monopolies generating a huge amount of rent controlled by the government who can give those rents to, say, people in the military, right? Which will support them and so forth. But then how do you think, like, how is this going to work then if you want to push for free trade in cigarettes, like have to say competition from Western cigarette manufacturers coming into China? Is that going to work? No, because of the institutional equilibrium that's there, the limited access order. How successful do you think the World Health Organization is going to be in reducing smoking in China? Who is interested in that other than the WHO, right? And so these sorts of stories can help give us insight. Okay, so this is my last example. And this is going to be from the book I wrote with Mark Koyama on persecution and toleration, A Long Road to Religious Freedom. So one more limited access order to give you an idea of how then this relates to the rise of liberal institutions, which is the story we tell in the book. This is one of my favorite pictures that I ever get to talk about. So it comes from the 14th century, and what it's showing us is the Emperor, Holy Roman Emperor Henry VII, going to Kablanc. So here's Henry VII, and he's giving a charter to the Jewish community, allowing them to come to Kablanc and to lend money. The context, the background is that at the time there were usury laws across Europe. So usury laws are restrictions that are common in religions. Islam also has them typically, but they say a Christian cannot lend money at interest. And so if Christians can't lend money at interest, well, Jews can. And Henry VII is basically saying to these Jews that you can come and lend money at interest. But of course now, and notice one thing here as well, there's a lot of identity rules going on here. That's one of the reasons I like this picture so much. The Jews are distinguished from other groups in society by what they're forced to wear. You can tell that this is Henry VII because of what he's wearing, but also because his horse is flying off the ground. You can see there's a strict ordering behind him. You have bishops, then you have soldiers, right? There's a strict hierarchy and identity is established throughout this. And these identity rules, that is not treating people as individuals, but treating people as a member of some other identity group, is a characteristic of a pre-modern society and also many developing societies that we see today. The way that this limited access order is working with these identity rules is that Jews are being granted monopoly rights, in effect, in Kablanc to lend money at interest, but they don't get to keep these. They don't get to keep the profits from lending at interest. Instead, the city of Kablanc will tax those profits away. That's going to be relatively easy for them to do because the Jews are going to be forced to live in the same area. They have a very distinct identity. And also, this system reinforces anti-Semitism. Jews are acting as monopoly, they're acting as usurers, right? They're lending money at interest, and it's potentially high interest because they have monopoly power. What most people don't see is that they don't get to keep the rents, that are being generated from this because it's being taxed away. So this is a type of a limited access order where you have a pernicious reinforcing equilibrium between the finances of the town are being provided by this Jewish group lending money at interest. And at the same time, anti-Semitism is being reinforced to the economic relations because people see the Jews lending money at interest, and this makes them not like the Jews. And that's going to put the Jews in a precarious position in terms of persecution. So we talk about these sorts of stories a lot in our book. It's available for $20 on Amazon. You should all purchase it after you finish listening to me talk here. And the story we basically tell in the book goes like this. These identity rules that I talked about, they're cheap, right? And this allows there to be low state capacity. You don't have to invest in some formal tax system or anything like that for much of the history of Europe. I'm talking around 800 to 1600. Furthermore, religious legitimacy is a really important source of identity. And so these two things, identity rules and religious legitimation of rule, also reinforce each other. And finally, that religious legitimacy also is reinforcing low state capacity, okay? Because you can outsource a lot of what a state usually would do to those religious authorities. This ends up being a self-reinforcing equilibrium, which is very stable. I mentioned it lasts from the Carolingian Empire all the way through to around 1600 or so when the Reformation hit. Religious minorities are put in a precarious position and subject to violence because of it, and it puts limits on economic growth. You think about it, if there's low factor mobility, there's a high potential for violence, and there's a lot of rent seeking out there. And it's not just Jews. Guilds are also part of this system. They work in a very similar way. Women have a certain identity. First, second, third estates in France, those are identities, right, that are strong during this period. It's pervasive, like these sorts of equilibria, and you should go read the book to learn more about it. Why does it break down? It breaks down because there are increases in state capacity due to other things I don't have time to get into, like the military revolution, which is fun to talk about, but it's time for another day. And there's also the Reformation, which fundamentally undermines the religious legitimacy, for example. Once you start having not just the Catholic Church, but a Protestant church as well, a Reformed church, that starts undermining the self-reinforcing equilibrium. And then you get the adoption of general rules, which we think of as religious freedom, which is a cornerstone of modern liberalism. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up here because it's time. So let me tell you about something Doug once told me in grad school. So this is grad school me right here. The only difference being that I had hair and I could read faster at the time. So in grad school, I just presented a pretty bad paper, okay, in the grad seminar. And by the way, it was a grad seminar that Doug ran by himself and didn't let any other senior faculty show up because he didn't want us to be intimidated. And not being intimidated, I gave a very bad paper. And he said to me afterwards, Noel, if there's not a price in your paper, then you're not doing economics, which is actually pretty good advice, right? I tell it to my graduate students today as well, when they're often writing long, rambling things. If you don't have a price in there, you're probably not doing economics, and you want to do economics because that's what you're getting your PhD in. So tell me what the prices are, and then do the analysis on them. But the key here is that over the course of his career, Doug North moved away, okay, from emphasizing the relatively easily observed prices that economists like. And he was pushing more and more things like culture, religion, and politics as being first order when we want to understand institutional change, which really is the name of the game and what we're trying to do. And this is hard because we have very good models of economic markets because they have these observable prices, but this is not so for culture, religion, and politics. And I say this as somebody who's a card-carrying member of the culture, religion, and politics organizations within economics. We care a lot about these and we'd like to study them. And there are a lot of smart people studying them, but they are hard, right? Because you don't have these easy to observe things. And so in many, many ways, Doug North made it harder to study institutions, correctly so, because this is, I think, the right way to do it. But his career was always pushing things in this difficult direction. But if this all sounds too complicated, there's always Plan B, which was also pioneered by Doug. So this was a tweet that came across my feed last week by Mike Munger. And so this is what he said, so my advisor, Doug North, was the best at this. This is a tweet that was in response to I think a graduate student who was talking about being afraid to present at seminars. And Munger says, Doug would present a superficial, poorly argued 12-page paper with 7 citations, 4 to himself. The discussant would say, this is terrible. If you want to do this the right way, you'd say blah, 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 blah. And Doug would be all like, and write down notes furiously. And then, of course, his paper would be written, and Douglas North would be moving on to his next version. This was brave, and this was common, and this is often the kind of thing that he did. But that's all I have to say, so thank you very much.
So the first question works as a nice bridge from our last lecture with Professor Hertzberg. Can you talk about the main differences between North's and the approaches of the Ostroms?
Right, so Eleanor Ostrom, I think so she's doing polycentricity, right? And talking about how you establish good management of common pool resources and basically overcoming, these potential externality problems. I mean, they're consistent with each other. I don't think North takes so I'm as Pete Betke loves to point out, I'm a bit of a, maybe maverick is too nice of a word for it. I'm not a maverick anything, but I'm a bit of a black sheep, right? Among libertarians. The state plays a big role, in a lot of what I talk about. And I often read that into the people who I study as well and who I learn from. But I don't think North took a really super strong stance, right? On that things had to be bottom up or top down, right? I'm not sure Eleanor Ostrom necessarily does either. It's just certain things, are, solved better, right? Through some bottom up approach. And it's just the multiplicity, right? Of things coming together. So I think they're highly consistent. Her methods were just very different, than what North used. Which, by the way, you probably have come up already in this seminar, but her early work looking at doing ride-alongs with police officers and things like that is super relevant and interesting in our current situation for how to solve policing problems and things like this, because it's quite complicated. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but it's the answer I'm going to go with. I think there's nothing I think too inconsistent between the two, aside from methods are different. And I find North's work to be more helpful for me when I think about the role of, say, a state, state capacity and generating liberal institutions and things like that. But that's not a fault also.
So let's talk about state capacity.
Okay.
What is it? Where does it come from? Why is it important? And my follow-up question is going to be about state capacity libertarianism.
Okay. Okay, good. So what is state capacity? So there are many ways of defining this, but the way we'll go with right now is you can think of state capacity has two components. One is fiscal capacity and one is administrative capacity. And basically fiscal capacity just means, does the political entity have the ability to extract revenue? And administrative, from the population that's there. And administrative capacity is, does that political entity have the ability to get done what it wants to get done? Usually if you're unable to extract revenue, you can't get done what you want to get done. So these things tend to go together, right? They're highly correlated, although they are separate, right? So for example, so we think France is what's easiest to go back to at 6 o'clock on a Saturday night, right? But in France, in say 1500 or so, there was a lot of revenues being collected, but it wasn't necessarily a high capacity state, because a lot of these revenues were being collected by private entities called tax farms, right? Which were being subcontracted with to collect those revenues. And they had not perfect freedom to collect the money any way they wanted, but they were not bureaucrats, like in a Weberian sense, right? They had no pension, they had no identity with the government, right? The monarchy. They were just private agents who would bid at auction for the right to collect tax revenues. So that's a situation where you might have a lot of revenues coming in, but that's not an organizational form, that's high capacity. Okay, Mark and I have written some stuff on that, right? Koyama and I, right? Okay, so that's what is state capacity, right? And it's different, by the way. One of the big differences is it's not rule of law, right? So when we talk about like Acemoglu and Robinson's inclusive institutions, or Northwallis and Weingast, they're open access institutions, which I probably should have mentioned because I talked about limited access, but the better thing is open access, right? You talk about those sorts of things, that's a higher standard than just having state capacity. State capacity is just those two things, right? And you could have a government that doesn't necessarily obey rule of law, it obeys rule by the individual, right? It's the person doing it, right? Like a monarch or something like that. But nonetheless, that government could have high state capacity. Why is it important? Okay, so one thing that, if you don't have state capacity, it's very, very hard to have rule of law, right? And in fact, I challenge somebody to come up with the example where you have, some stable open access institutions or inclusive institutions in place where you don't have state capacity in place as well. Somebody out there is yelling Hong Kong. Well, actually, somebody used to be yelling Hong Kong, but they don't do it anymore, right? For this, right? Good luck. Thinking of the one, that fits in that corner of the square, right? But the classic example of thinking about why this matters. Think of tribalism, right? And what I was trying to convey with my French slide, there was a lot of tribalism, with the different language groups and things like that in France during the early modern period. But to use an example that's probably more realistic for everybody listening, let's just think about East Africa, right? Or something like this, right? And how do you get people with divergent backgrounds who affiliate first and foremost with a identity associated with their local group? We don't have to call it a tribe, right? But we all have tribes, right? But sometimes that local level thing is the most important thing to us, the family, right? Or the extended family, right? Or my language kin, right? You know, things like this. But then how do you get cooperation, you know, in a society like that, when this can be a highly fractionalized place? How do you get public goods taken care of? How do you develop, how do you get people to start trading with each other in an open way? And what we often find is that you need to have some relatively high capacity state there, leveling people, right? You know, like, so that they think of themselves as a broader group. And that starts opening the door towards having something like a constitution and a broader group in place. And what a constitution is simply just a document that states a bunch of things that we all kind of agree on and makes them common knowledge, right? So that I know that you know that I know that you know that I know that you know that we're going to kill the president if he tries to tax us at 100% rate, right? You know, something like that. That's in the Constitution, right? You know, it's a trigger, right? Like, you know, in that sense. So state capacity, it seems to be really important because it's highly correlated with having rule of law, which I really want us to have. And state capacity also seems to be something that is a precursor in many times to developing that rule of law. And it seems to be something that you need to get to before you can have society itself, not from the outside, but from the inside, reforming itself, you know, and developing these open access structures. I'm using them all kind of interchangeably. Did I catch, I don't know if I answered all your questions there, but I did some of them. Yeah, okay.
That's great. So what are your thoughts about Tyler Cowen's state capacity libertarianism?
Oh, I love it. I mean, first of all, he mentions Mark and I like in it, so that's great. But no, I think, so there is I've always respected like the way Tyler thinks about things. You know, he's relatively moderate, at least within my realm of the world. It's hard to gauge what's moderate at the moment. But the state capacity libertarianism, I think it's absolutely right that you need to have minimal structures of a state in order to accomplish goals that we value as a society. And we're not going to do a very good job at it if we don't have those. I think that's the crux, you know, of what he's arguing for there. The devil's in the details, right? You know, what is the minimal amount, right? You know, that we want to have. You know, do we want to have a post office, right? I don't know. I don't need one, right? You know, like, but maybe we need one, right? You know, do we want to have, I mean, universal ID cards, right? You know, yeah, if there's a committee that makes sure it doesn't get violated, right? You know, somewhere, and we trust that committee, right? All these sorts of things. I mean, the debate right now about the FDA, right? You know, is like very much, you know, along these lines as well, which I think my colleague Alex Tabarrok is coming out on top of at the moment to a great extent. So what do I think of it? I think he's right, you know, about it. Yeah.
Okay, great.
I'll die on that hill. Yeah.
Okay. It's a good segue to our next question, which is, what is the place of institutional analysis in liberalism more broadly?
Right. Like, you know, so I wasn't quite sure I understood that question. I mean, we usually say these are liberal institutions, right? You know, like, you know, when we say something like a cornerstone of liberal institutions, if you're like, you know, like Blackford or something like this, like, you know, you would say religious liberty is a cornerstone, you know, of liberal institutions. But then you got to start thinking about, well, you know, what are those institutions, right? You know, like, you know, what do we mean by that, right? And what we mean in some sense is not writing laws that distinguish how people are treated based on their religious beliefs, right? And so I think the whole point of the book with Mark Koyama and myself is trying to talk about how you move from a set of illiberal institutions, right? You know, regarding, say, religious freedom, and how there was a process involving state capacity, you know, interacting with a bunch of other things to get to the place where you have your religious freedom and it's self-enforcing, right? And so, I mean, the way that institutions are related is that that's what we're talking about when we talk about, I think, you know, liberalism, okay? But some understanding institutional change is really important if we value, maintaining it, right? And having the appropriate amount of liberal belief. Okay.
Great. Help us think through the trade-offs and maybe benefits of limited access orders compared to open access orders.
Open access is better if you can get it, but so open access order, I think people understand what it is, but if you're going to have open access in the economic market, so you have free entry, if you have free entry and exit from a market, then by definition you don't have monopoly power, right? In that market, but then you also don't have rents being generated, okay? That you would use to trade. But that's also going to be consistent with having open access in a political market, meaning you have anybody can run for election, right? Or something like this, okay? So anyway, that's what we mean by that. That is going to be better, both from the point of view of economic efficiency, right? Because you do not have the barriers to entry on the economic side. That's just an unambiguous good thing, right? On the economic side. Open access in political markets is also going to be, in my opinion, an unambiguously good thing, because you have more economic flourishing, right? Kind of in Amartya Sen kind of formulation, your voice can be heard, which is a valuable thing, okay? And you also get better information, about what people want, right? All these other sorts of things. Now that doesn't mean it's rather trite for me to say that, because what we have in most places are limited access orders, right? When I really want to bother John Wallace, I always ask him, when the United States transitioned, what day, right? Did we go from being a limited access order to an open access order? So it's an unfair question, right? But we're more open access-y at the moment than we are limited access-y, right? And it is kind of a distinct transition, right? That takes place. It's hard to have partial, right? In places. But part of what I hope I conveyed a little bit is that the limited access order is really hard to reform. You can't just do the economic side, because there'll be no support for it, and you'll create civil war, right? There'll be breakdown, right? On the government side. But then that means, are we going to reform the politics? Well, the World Bank's not a military organization, right? And that seems to be a bad idea anyway. So how do you do it all at once, right? And that's one of the reasons why I like to think about the state capacity, because in many ways, I think there are benefits that can come from building state capacity, where people start thinking about society in a broader way, and it makes it more amenable for the bottom up to meet the top down, right? In terms of reform. So that's good.